Welcome back to Cheddar, everyone. Well, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi setting a new deadline, for the coronavirus stimulus deal. Pelosi putting 48 hours on the clock after speaking with Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin on Saturday night. Take a listen.
48 only relates to if we want to get it done before the election, which we do.
Well, don't you? Yeah.
Yeah, so which we do. But we're saying to them, we have to freeze the design on some of these things. Are we going with it or not? And what is the language? I'm optimistic.
Joining us now is Lori Bettinger, who is the co-president and that's of Alliance Partners and former director of the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Lori, great to have you here with us today. That deadline, it expires soon. So how likely is it that we're going to see a deal before the election?
Well, thanks so much for having me. You know, I have to say, I really hope that we get a deal done before the election, but it doesn't seem that likely. It just feels like right now, the House and the Senate are so far apart in what they're looking for, and in particular, the magnitude of a stimulus package, that it's really hard to see a way to bridge that in what feels like a relatively short period of time.
Okay, and so help us break this down particularly, because even if Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi come to an agreement, this still has to work its way through the Senate. And so what are the things that the Senate is going to be looking for?
Well, it seems like, in particular, the one thing the Senate wants to see is a package that's much smaller in size than anything we've heard discussed by Speaker Pelosi. You know, I think the Senate has mentioned a willingness to look at perhaps extending an existing program, like reopening PPP, which is still relatively small in scope. But, you know, the size that they seem to talk about is maybe $500 million, whereas you're hearing, I think, over $2 billion on the House side. And there's different components of that, but it just seems like right now the Senate is not interested in passing a large stimulus package, and the House is. And I just don't know where you find, what could be, close to $1 trillion of differences, how you can reconcile that right now.
Sure. And so for the Senate, where we've seen the Republican-led Senate really focus on not closing down the economy once again. Yeah. Parts of the economy right now, small businesses, they've had to close back down because they do not have the funding to continue to move forward, because the promises are not there on any type of stimulus or aid package that's going to continue to help small businesses and the unemployed throughout this time. But it's interesting because I find that if there's an argument that is made for not closing down the economy again, that has to directly be tied to what are the things that we can do to keep the economy open. And part of that comes back down to testing and contact tracing as well. We've seen the airlines, the airports institute a broader mind frame of testing to try and woo travelers back. We've seen testing be the core to sports leagues operating. And it seems that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi specifically called attention to changes in wording around testing and tracing. Do you think that there will be a meeting in the middle on this matter?
I certainly hope so, because I think that the way I understand it, it was originally envisioned to have requirements for testing. And I think there was some discussion around the watering down of language and things, like must turning to should. But I agree that you can't look at any stimulus without looking at, first of all, the incredibly important role that small businesses play in the economy at all times, but really the disproportionate impact that they have felt from this. And, I think when you looked at the initial stimulus packages, I don't think they were ever designed to be one and done. I mean, just look at PPP. It was designed to help small businesses over such a small time period, with the hopes that, we would shut down for a few months and life would get back to normal. Clearly that hasn't happened. But then you saw small businesses take almost a second hit as they, hired back their employees. They revamped, let's say in the case of restaurants, they revamped their kitchens to, try and make themselves more compliant, and then found themselves confronting another wave. And in many cases, diners who weren't comfortable eating in the restaurant, regardless of any changes that they'd made. And so I think that, to say that you can fix small businesses without fixing, the public health crisis, and as you mentioned, testing to give consumers confidence to go into stores, to continue making purchases, I just don't see how that happens. And then on the other hand, when we had the stimulus payments directly to consumers in some of the early CARES Acts, I think you did see small businesses directly benefit from that, because when you look at most of those funds, most of those $1,200 checks, a lot of that was getting injected directly back into the economy. I think small businesses had a chance to directly benefit from that. But I mean, you can look at some of the larger businesses that are still doing fine, but small businesses, I really think across the country, continue to suffer.
What are the prospects that we get a stimulus deal if we see a Democratic sweep, as some of the polls are adjusting for and accounting for, and even some of the economists on Wall Street are now trying to price in as well? If Biden wins the election, are we going to see Trump lose interest in a stimulus deal?
It's a great question. I mean, I would hope that the answer would be no. And, for the good of the country, it would still be all systems go for trying to reach a deal as quickly as possible and, not waiting for January, in which case, I think we will see tens of thousands of small businesses across the country continue to close through, November, December, the first part of January. But I don't know that I think the chances are huge. I could see that some people with more of a political slant might not want to hand, a victory that would be felt by a new administration. But I would certainly think that any administration that takes office, in January, if there hasn't been a new stimulus passed by then, I just think the pain is going to be so much more severe, and that has to be one of the first acts of any new administration.
And for the next presidential term, of course, one of the concerns will be paying down a lot of the spending that we are doing right now. And so as you kind of consider what we've seen from both of the economic plans from both candidates, is there a clear plan on how we will eventually pay this down?
A clear plan might be too strong of a too strong of a description for how we're going to pay this down. But I do think the one thing that you see many mainstream economists agree on is that you can't, when we're looking at this type of recession, you can't focus on the deficit at the cost of a stimulus that's big enough. If we just do a bunch of sort of half-hearted measures, we'll add to the deficit without actually improving the economy. I think these are headwinds. We've never seen these types of headwinds before. And we do have to spend to make sure we can get through them. And then I think look at the sensible cuts, the sensible ways to increase revenue. But if the fear of that, at this point, I don't think that should be sort of stopping a stimulus from really trying to do its job around the country.
That's my over-optimistic nature coming out when I mentioned a clear plan there, perhaps. Lori Bettinger, who's the co-president and co-president of Alliance Partners and former director of the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Thanks for taking the time today.